The Garden of Time by J.G. Ballard. Axel passed the next morning quietly in his library, sealing the rarer of his manuscripts into the glass-topped cases between the galleries. He walked slowly down to the portrait corridor, polishing each of the pictures carefully, then tidied his desk and locked the door behind him. During the afternoon he busied himself in the drawing rooms, unobtrusively assisting his wife as she cleaned their ornaments and straightened the vases and busts. By evening, as the sun fell behind the house, they were both tired and dusty, and neither had spoken to the other all day. When his wife moved towards the music room, Axel called her back. "Tonight, we will pick the flowers together, my dear," he said to her evenly. "One for each of us." He peered only briefly over the wall. They could hear, less than half a mile away, the great dull roar of the ragged army, the ring of iron and lash, pressing on towards the house. Quickly, Axel plucked his flower, a bud no bigger than a sapphire. As it flickered softly, the tumult outside momentarily receded, then began to gather again. Shutting his ears to the clamor, Axel looked around at the villa, counting the 6 columns in the portico, then gazed out across the lawn at the silver disk of the lake, its bowl reflecting the last evening light, and the shadows moving between the tall trees, lengthening across the crisp turf. He lingered over the bridge, where he and his wife had stood arm in arm for so many summers. "Axel!" The tumult outside roared into the air. 1,000 voices bellowed only 20 or 30 yards away. A stone flew over the wall and landed among the thyme flowers, snapping several of the brittle stems. The Countess ran towards him as a further barrage rattled along the wall. Then a heavy tile whirled through the air over their heads and crashed into one of the conservatory windows. "Axel!" He put his arms around her, straightening his silk cravat when her shoulder brushed it between his lapels. "Quickly, my dear, the last flower." He led her down the steps and through the garden. Taking the stem between her jeweled fingers, she snapped it cleanly, then cradled it within her palms. For a moment the tumult lessened slightly, and Axel collected himself. In the vivid light sparkling from the flower, he saw his wife's white, frightened eyes. "Hold it as long as you can, my dear, until the last grain dies." Together they stood on the terrace. The Countess clasped the brilliant dying jewel, the air closing in upon them as the voices outside mounted again, the mob battering at the heavy iron gates, and the whole villa shook with the impact. While the final glimmer of light sped away, the Countess raised her palms to the air, as if releasing an invisible bird, then, in a final access of courage, put her hands in her husband's, her smile as radiant as the vanished flower. "Oh, Axel!" she cried. Like a sword, the darkness swooped down across them. Heaving and swearing, the outer edges of the mob reached the knee-high remains of the wall enclosing the ruined estate, hauled their carts over it, and along the dry ruts of what once had been an ornate drive. The ruin, formerly a spacious villa, barely interrupted the ceaseless tide of humanity. The lake was empty, fallen trees rotting at its bottom, an old bridge rusting into it. Weeds flourished among the long grass in the lawn, overrunning the ornamental pathways and carved stone screens. Much of the terrace had crumbled, and the main section of the mob cut straight across the lawn, bypassing the gutted villa. But one or two of the more curious climbed up and searched among the shell. The doors had rotted from their hinges, and the floors had fallen through. In the music room, an ancient harpsichord had been chopped into firewood, but a few keys still lay among the dust. and the books had been toppled from the shelves in the library. The canvases had been slashed, and gilt frames littered the floor. As the main body of the mob reached the house, it began to cross the wall at all points along its length. Jostled together, the people stumbled into the dry lake, swarmed over the terrace, and pressed through the house towards the open doors on the north side. One area alone withstood the endless wave. Just below the terrace, between the wrecked balcony and the wall, was a dense, 6-foot-high growth of heavy thorn bushes, where 2 stone statues stood side by side, gazing out over the grounds from their protected vantage point. The larger of the figures was the effigy of a bearded man in a high-collared jacket, a cane under one arm. Beside him was a woman in an elaborate full-skirted dress, her slim, serene face unmarked by the wind and rain. In her left hand, she lightly clasped a single rose, the delicately formed petals so thin as to be almost transparent. As the sun died away behind the house, a single ray of light glanced through a shattered cornice and struck the rose, reflected off the whirl of the petals onto the statues, lighting up the gray stone so that for a fleeting moment it was indistinguishable from the long vanished flesh of the statue's original.